The year is 1929 and Detroit is bursting at the seams. Immigrants from the edges of the world burrowing their way into the city's flesh. In 1910, the city had 285,000 souls. By 1929, 1.5 million pairs of feet scurried back and forth to their factory posts,
their wooden tenements. Has any city ever grown so fast as the little river fort founded by Antoine de la Mode Cadillac? Such a question is unanswerable, given our palsied grasp on the facts of history. But suffice it to say that in those days Detroit was a cauldron of many ingredients, fired to the boil by assembly lines running night and day, with rooming houses renting beds out by the 8-hour shift. A giant work camp is really all it was, its Babel-tongued citizens united only by sweat and toil. A land of opportunity, yes, but a land of different opportunities for different people. Our story concerns 3 men, 2 foreigners, and a man of native birth from some unknown corner of the southern croplands. These men each came to Detroit with their own strange dreams and made use of the opportunities they found. Now let us meet our first subject, an expert opportunist in this land of milk-fed suckers and honey-drenched rubes. Benedetto Evangelista, aka Benny Evangelist, self-proclaimed divine prophet. Benny plied his trade of spiritual flim-flam on Detroit's east side, near Eastern Market, where the farmers brought their lettuces and potatoes every morning to sell to the Italian shopkeepers and vegetable cartmen that plied their honest trade in Little Italy, while Benny plied his tricks out of the home he shared with his wife and 4 small children on St. Aubin Street. Born in Naples, Italy in 1896 as Benedetto Evangelista, Benny's first beachhead in the New World was in Philadelphia, where he joined an older brother named Antonio. Antonio, by his own accounts, disowned his brother Benedetto when he began having mystic visions of a non-Catholic nature and sent him on to York, Pennsylvania, and a job on a railroad construction crew. Benny's best friend in York, a fellow Neapolitan, was one Aurelius Angelino, and the 2 of them began to dabble in the occult. Apparently, Aurelius was unable to take the Ouija boards and tarot cards with the proper grain of salt, because in 1919 he started hacking his family to death with an axe, being stopped only after 2 of his children were dead. Needless to say, Aurelius was sent to a prison for the criminally insane, while Benny himself moved on to Detroit to start anew for the 3rd time, 3 being an auspicious number. What sort of a place did young Benedetto, seer of visions, find when he arrived in his new home? Streets paved with gold. Hudson's downtown department store was the tallest in the world, for example. Henry Ford's introduction of the $5 a day wage and the auto industry's general overflowing abundance were transforming peasants into proto-bourgeoisies by the minute. But Detroit was a stern mother to her children. She would love them, yes, but only if they came to work. Only if they came to sacrifice their bodies in the foundries like virgins tossed into the hungry volcano of industry. And so they came, and the days of their lives were melted away like pig iron in the forge, and the gold in the street could only be pried loose by the picks and axes of the industrialist strongmen. White and Protestant by law, as it was they themselves who built the law. The anger they must have had, some of them. Those foreign aliens, those Appalachian trash, those black sphinxes. No wonder they sought solace in their made-up religions. Benedetto even reconstructed the universe right in his basement. In fact, if you stood at street level on the corner of St. Aubin and Mack Avenue and cocked your head at just the proper angle, you could see inside the basement window. And there was his personal cosmology for all to see, a hand-painted sign announcing to the public, Great Celestial Planet Exhibition, from papier-mâché and wires and wood he had built, all by himself. 9 planets and a sun with an electric eye that sat in the center. Benedetto had learned the trade of carpentry somewhere, and in a boomtown like Detroit, this had afforded him the prosperity to escape the assembly line chain gang and to dabble in real estate, as well as build the universe he saw in his mind right there in his own basement. The planets, according to the newspaper accounts, were in-orbited demons, circles of monstrosity, and they hung low to the ground, so that Evangelista's disciples, customers, could touch them. The mystic, the prophet, the faith healer, the snake oil salesman, the charmer, the cheater, the psychotic, they all found fertile soil in which to plant themselves when they arrived in Detroit, and Evangelista was one of these men. In addition to his carpentry and real estate, he sold potions and did psychic healings upon those who paid his fees, which went as high as $10, 2 full days on the assembly line. He was doing quite well for himself, having taken on a wife, and along with their 4 children, they had settled into a house at 3457 St. Aubin, and Benedetto Evangelista now called himself Benny Evangelist. Without the foreigners at the end. Their home appeared to be, the only evidence being that faded microfiche from 90 years ago, a large and comfortable one, with a wide porch and fresh green paint adorning its wooden planks. An oasis where the luxuries of self-discovery could be indulged as the streetcars passed by, carrying the working men to work. Divine prophet, wife, 4 children hacked to death, the wholesale tragedy, laid to fanatics, humble St. Aubin Avenue home is scene of murders. The Detroit police, a semi-pro team at best, failed to keep newspaper reporters and the dozens of gawkers from contaminating the crime scene, destroying any potential clues save one, a bloody fingerprint on the doorknob of the home. The Detroit Free Press broke the news to the stunned city on Independence Day morning, 1929. A man named Vincent Elias had come to the Evangelist home on July 3rd at 10:30 a.m. to discuss a real estate deal with Benny, and had found Benny sitting behind his desk, his hands across his chest. His headless body was but mildly slumped forward, and his severed head lay on the floor beside his chair. The 3 older children, all girls, were found in a room on the 2nd floor, their heads crushed with an axe. Santina, the wife, was found in the marital bed with the young boy, Mario, at her side. They too had been hacked in the skull. The victims: Benny Evangelist A, age 43. Santina, his wife, age 43. Santina, his wife, age 40. Children: Angeline, 8 years old, Margaret, later said to be a boy named Matthew, age 6, Jean, 4, and Mario, the other only boy, aged 18 months. An interesting and insightful footnote to show just how new American was then and how things we take for granted, such as Italians being named Mario, had not yet become fully incorporated into Americana. The newspapers reported the infant boy's name as Maro. Nearly the entire homicide division was dispatched immediately to the crime scene, though one should not confuse the application of all this police manpower with any sort of competence. When the police arrived, alongside Evangelist's severed head, they found 3 large framed photographs of a child in a coffin. The photo of the child in the coffin was later determined to be that of a son that the Evangelistas once had, but who died before his first birthday some years earlier. What could this have meant? And now the strangeness begins to build upon itself. Numerous copies of a book Evangelista had written and self-published, for he was an author in addition to being a carpenter, real estate salesman, faith healer, and divine prophet, littered the room. The oldest history of the world discovered by occult science. My story is from my own views and science that I see from 12 to 3 a.m. I began on February 2nd, 1906 in Philadelphia, and it was completed on February 2nd, 1926 in the city of Detroit, county of Wayne, state of Michigan. On this new earth, the last one was created by God, the Father Celestial, and the great prophet meal. We call it today the Great Union Federation of America. I am with the power of God, and I respect this nation. In this book, I shall express all my views of past 20 years. In this great continent are all the generations. By the willingness of God, my respect to this nation, I shall do my best to tell you of the old world. I shall tell about the world before God was created up until this last generation. And I shall explain to you your descendants. Opening preface. Published in 1926, the Detroit police, a semi-pro team at best, failed to keep newspaper reporters and the dozens of gawkers from contaminating the crime scene, destroying any potential clues save one, a bloody fingerprint on the doorknob of the home. To make matters even more difficult, most of Evangelist heirs, neighbors, and clientele were recent Sicilian and Italian immigrants and were less than willing to provide information to law enforcement.
detectives were unable to compel even one of Evangelist's client's disciples into making an official statement that could have provided at least some starting point from which to launch their investigation. Evangelist has own records and the collection of personal trinkets, including articles of women's clothing, often used for casting love spells or hexes on against the owner, found in the home proved that hundreds of people had come to him for service, but scarcely a handful even admitted they had known him. Several pieces of women's undergarments, each tagged with the name of its owner, police point out, reveal that the so-called mystic indulged in practices of voodooism, or devil worship. Such garments, voodooism has it, can lead to the finding of a missing person when they are properly handled by one versed in the mystic arts of that belief. Detroit Free Press, July 5th, 1929. The police used the limited evidence at hand to pursue three very different theories. Theory 1 revolved around several notes found in the Evangelist, a home that pointed to Benny being extorted by La Mano Nera, or the Black Hand in English. The Black Hand was a loose confederation of Italian criminals that used intimidation and murder to extort money from Italian immigrants. The great opera tenor Enrico Caruso fell victim to them. In one 90-day stretch, 15 people were murdered by the so-called shotgun man on a single block in Chicago's Little Italy. One of the letters dated 6 months before the murders told Evangelista, "This is your last chance." The problem with the Black Hand extortion theory was that by 1929 the Black Hand had long since evolved into the traditional mafia structure of Italian organized crime, and crude extortion schemes were a thing of the past. Caruso's run-in with La Mano Nera dated back to 1910, and Shotgun Man had disappeared from Chicago before 1920. Whoever was trying to extort Benny was almost certainly an amateur just looking for an easy mark, not part of a syndicate capable of the grisly murders that took place on St. Aubin Street. The second theory was significantly more plausible. A 42-year-old man from the area named Umberto Tecchio visited the Evangelist A, home the night before the bodies were found. He was making final payment on a house Evangelist A had sold him. Tecchio, along with a friend who'd accompanied him to St. Aubin Street the night before the murder named Angelo Di Poli, were brought in for questioning the next day when an axe, a keen-edged banana knife, and a pair of suspiciously clean work boots were found in the barn behind the boarding house they lived in. Tecchio and Di Poli not only didn't confess to the murders but stated that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and they'd gone out drinking after dropping the last payment on Tecchio's home off to Evangelista. Newspaper accounts mentioned that Tecchio, just 3 months prior to the massacre, had knifed his brother-in-law to death in an argument. How he escaped prosecution for that is unclear, but it certainly gave investigators reason to make him a prime suspect. However, with no physical evidence and no confession, Tecchio was let go and died a few years later in 1934. After Tecchio's death, the continuing investigation into Detroit's largest mass murder uncovered a newspaper delivery boy who told police he had seen Tecchio on Evangelist A's front porch on the morning of the murders. But what does that recollection weigh in the face of no motive, no evidence, and no confession? Who can say? And now our last hypothesis. In 1923, Benedetto's old friend Aurelius Angelino, axe-murderer of his own 2 children, escaped from the Pennsylvania prison for the criminally insane and was never seen again. Had Angelino somehow made his way to Detroit, where his old friend had set up his eerie basement shrine? Certainly possible, but what proof is there? The Detroit police seem to have put more credence and invested more of their time in Umberto Tecchio. But looking back now these 80-plus years, the very nature of the crime itself seems the most damning evidence against Aurelius Angelino. The M.O., as they said in old detective movies, the modus operandi, the method of operation, closely matches Aurelius's own crime back in York, and it is not hard to imagine that he slowly made his way west to Detroit and finally tracked his old partner in voodooism, as the newspapers called it, down, and upon Aurelius arriving at the door of the now prosperous Benedetto,
And upon Aurelius thinking back over the horrors, oh, how a baby killer must have been beaten by the asylum guards, of the almost 10 years that stood between that moment and their last meeting. What rage must have boiled inside him, and to see Benedetto there in his own personal fiefdom, and with his own personal universe built by his own hand, hang from the basement ceiling. And since Benny was found dead in his wizard's garb, sitting calmly at his desk, and since Benny himself wrote that he received his visions from 12 to 3 a.m., is it difficult to imagine Aurelius Angelino, escaped madman and convicted axe murderer, slithering in an open window while Benny sat in his trance in the early hours of July 3rd, 1929, and once inside the Evangelist A home? What difficulty would Aurelius have had in decapitating the man who had left him behind in York to rot in the insane asylum while he not only indulged his occult dreams but grew fat off selling spells and potions? And yet, after Angelino's escape from the state of Pennsylvania's lax custody in 1923, no record of his existence, whether in Detroit or anywhere else, can be found. How does a family of 6 become slaughtered by the sharp edge of an axe and the blunt force of its handle, and the killer simply disappear without a trace? As no arrest was ever made, let us just say that an evil spirit exacted retribution of some kind upon Benny and his unwitting family and disappeared into the dark night of Detroit, where the clang of the trolleys carrying the third shift to work and the distant hum of the automobile factories would have been audible in the distance, even as the killer left his bloody fingerprint on the doorknob when he let himself out. Evangelist, no doubt, was insane, said the parish priest who supervised the family's burial at Mount Olivet Cemetery. But I do not believe Evangelist was sincere in practicing the creed he had established. Rather, Rod. As a result of the prevalent illiteracy among these people and the large numbers of them who immigrated to the north, possibilities for employment diminished. The Depression period completely dispelled the rest of their hopes and reduced greatly their living standards. During these years, many militant and cultist groups arose which reflected the Negro's intense desire for racial improvement and recognition, and which based the position of the Negro in American society on the treatment afforded him by the white people. FBI case files concerning the Nation of Islam now, it is 1932. And to paraphrase the anonymous author of the FBI missive above, the Depression completely dispelled the hopes and reduced the standard of living for African Americans. So let us meet Robert Harris, a black man from Tennessee, who arrived in town just a few short months after the great crash of October 29 and the unsolved massacre of the Evangelista family on street. It was a different Detroit than one Benny the Evangelist had lived in. Not so much gold in the streets, especially for someone like Robert Harris. Robert soon fell in with a nascent religious movement led by one W.D. Fard, known as the Order of Islam. The order eventually came to be known as the Nation of Islam, and in that long ago day, just as it was in the time of Malcolm X and of Louis Farrakhan's Million Man March, it was a beacon of hope for the descendants of African slaves that came to its secret meeting places, halls, and temples. W.D. Fard, who we will discuss in detail after a brief excursion into the deeds of his follower, Robert Harris, had coined an apt, almost biblical, term for the world in which the black man lived in 1932. The wilderness of North America, a long tract, could be easily produced on the difficulties of a 44-year-old black man, grandson of slaves, in the 30% unemployed Detroit of the Great Depression, an elaborate psychological analysis of why he did the thing he did. But instead, I will just quote a brief part of Mr. Robert Harris's statement to the Detroit Police Department in regards to the murder he committed. The 9th hour of the 20th day had come Sunday. It was predestined 1,500 years ago that at that hour I must make a human sacrifice to my gods. It must not be a member of the Order of Islam, but some stranger, The first person I met after leaving my home. Harris went on to confess that he brought James Smith, who lived with him and his family in a rooming house at 1429 Dubois Street in the heart of Detroit's overpopulated Black Bottom neighborhood, into the cold and, safe to assume, poorly furnished front room that morning in November of 1932, where Harris's wife and children sat waiting, as they had been commanded by their hard-fisted husband and father. An important moment was at hand for the family. Harris told homicide detectives that Smith was a willing sacrifice and mounted an altar, stretched his arms and looked up. At the stroke of noon, Harris went on to say he himself plunged a knife into Mr. James Smith's heart, then crushed his skull with an automobile axle, just to quiet him. When police arrived, they found an 8-inch knife stuck into Smith's heart so deeply that only the handle protruded from his corpse. Once taken into custody, Harris, who also used the alias Robert Kerrian, supplied to him by the Order of Islam as an Asiatic replacement for his legal slave name, struggled in desperation with police when they tried to take a fingerprint of his left hand, which was gloved. The glove was eventually removed only by the force of a cadre of detectives. "My right hand belongs to everyone," Harris had told the detectives, "but my left hand belongs to the king." Once he was nominally subdued and in the close custody of the homicide division at police headquarters, Robert Harris Kerrian continued his maniacal confession to the entranced investigators. The murder victim, James Smith, so said the killer, was a member of the same cult and was living with him and his family at 1429 Dubois Street. Dubois is exactly 1 block east of St. Aubin Street, where the Evangelista family had been slaughtered. I told him that I had been commanded to kill somebody by the gods of Islam. At first he didn't want to be killed, but when I showed him that he would be the savior of the world and go to heaven right away, he said all right. The day had come, Sunday. He had to be killed just at noon, so I set a clock in front of the altar where everybody could see it. Smith was sitting in a chair in front of the altar. My wife was timekeeper. As the hour drew near, I said, "Smith, do you still want to be killed?" Because the command ordered me not to kill anybody who didn't want to be killed. Smith nodded his head. When it was just 12 o'clock, I said, "Smith, get up and stand on the altar." I grabbed my dirk knife and stabbed him like this. A piece of paper, not handwritten, but possibly found through demonic serendipity in some magazine or book, was indexed at the crime scene. Some said it was a passage from the original manual of the Order of Islam, later or alternatively known as the Nation of Islam, which the current Nation of Islam denies. It said, "The unbeliever must be stabbed through the heart." From the Detroit Free Press of November 22nd, 1932. Harris admitted that he slew Smith as part of the rites of his weird religion, while his wife, Queen Bertha Harris, and their children and disciples looked on. Detective Oscar Berry of the Homicide Squad checked his assertion, announced that all the evidence indicated its truth, and speculated upon the hold which the jungle cult may have upon certain ignorant elements of Detroit's Negro population. Harris's wife, Queen Bertha, told police that she and her children had been forced to prepare for and watch the murder under the threat of death themselves. Bertha made statements that she had been pulled from the marital bed and thrashed when she had first caught wind of the Harris' macabre plan, but that she and the children were all considered disciples by Harris and had no choice but to attend the ritual. Police declined to bring charges against Queen Bertha Harris. Embarrassed and desperate after their bungled investigation of the Evangelista murders on St. Aubin Street, the Detroit police initially hoped Harris would be identified as the killer in the still unsolved Evangelista slayings. But when Harris's fingerprints were compared with the bloody fingerprint found on the doorknob at the Evangelista home, the prints didn't match. Harris himself denied knowing anything about the Evangelista family massacre. Detroit Free Press transcript of Robert Harris's guilty plea in front of Judge Boyne at Detroit Recorder's Court. Friday, November 25th, 1932, the day after Thanksgiving. Judge Boyne, take off your cap. Harris does not comply. Harris, I am king here. Judge Boyne, oh no, you are not. I'm the king here. Harris, no sir, I'm the king here and everywhere. Discussion interrupted as a bailiff of the court removes Harris's cap. Judge Boyne,
Did you kill James Smith, Harris? Yes, I did. Harris replaces the cap on his head. It is again removed by the bailiff. Harris: I did kill this man at 1429 Dubois Street. Judge Boyne: Why did you kill him? Harris: It was crucifixion time. That's why I killed him. Judge Boyne: What did you kill him with? Harris: With the crucifixion. I said, I like a rump, and he fell dead. He died because it's a dumb civilization. But I gave my children a break because I'm a lover of children. Well, I've got to go now. Harris starts to walk toward the door. Judge Boyne: You'd better wait a minute. Harris then grabs a box of rubber bands from the clerk's desk and begins stuffing them into his pocket. Judge Boyne: Put those back. Harris: No, I'm kidding. Harris continues to stuff the rubber bands into his pocket. He also puts his cap back on his head. The court bailiff recovers the rubber bands, while another takes the cap from Harris's head, his final dethronement, and leads him out of Judge Boyne's court and into a prison cell. From there, he exits the stage of history. Prison records from that era are hard to find, and the final fate of Robert Harris is long lost. But it is easily imagined that he was finally released from the Ionia prison for the criminally insane again many years later, as his maniacal energy weakened along with the strength of his body. And Robert Harris Carrion, the king, walked the streets of Detroit once more as an old man in that tumultuous decade of the 1960s. The house where he killed his willing victim and the temple where he once worshipped at the feet of Master Fard would have been long gone by then, and he would have had no real bearings on the world. No landmarks to moor his tenuous grasping toward reality. Perhaps he muttered on the street to people passing by as he begged for change. His old voice, a harbinger for the coming riot and the deaths that would fill the city of Detroit as it hurtled toward Century's terminus. As it became known as the Murder City and took its place upon the altar of history to be sacrificed, unwanted and unneeded, like the man named James Smith, who Robert Harris had plunged his knife into inside that little tenement room so many years before.